Less than 2 years ago, the world was on the brink of another Great Depression. And we're not out of trouble yet, or not out of the woods yet, as Kevin Rudd likes to say, as Europe's sovereign debt crisis engulfs world markets. But the global economy didn't slip into the abyss in 2008, and that was largely due to the efforts of the world's most powerful central bank, the US Federal Reserve. At least that's the contention of our next guest, David Wessel, author of In Fed We Trust, Ben Bernanke's War on the Great Panic. David's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and economics editor of the Wall Street Journal, and he's currently in Australia to speak at the Sydney Writers' Festival. He joins us in the breakfast studio now. David, welcome to breakfast.
Well, thank you.
Let's start with Europe before we get to the inside story of the Fed. The global financial crisis now seems to have morphed into a sovereign debt crisis, with Europe, not the US, at the epicentre. Is this a more dangerous phase in your view?
It certainly is a dangerous phase. Just when we thought it was safe to go into the water, we have a whole lot of sharks out there. And what makes it somewhat frightening is in the first phase, the banks were in trouble, the governments bailed them out. Now governments are in trouble, so the only people who can bail out governments are supra-governments, like the European Union, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund. So there's not much line of defense left in this financial crisis.
So this debt crisis in Europe has the potential to derail the global economic recovery?
It does if the following happens. If it leads people to flee the euro and invest money in Australia, Canada, China, and the US, then we're okay. If, though, it frightens people who have memories of how bad things can get, and they all sort of say, I don't want to take any risks all at once. They want to all put their money in U.S. Treasury bills or something like that, then we do have a problem. We're not there yet, but that's the risk.
A former Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, said last week that this crisis could derail the euro. Today, the EU president said the euro is fundamentally healthy.
Well, the people who are in charge of the euro have to express confidence in it. If Jean-Claude Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank, showed one bit of doubt about the viability of the euro, it would collapse. There are tensions in the European Union Eurozone approach. We have very different countries that are pulling in different directions. They have one monetary policy, but as we've seen, they have different fiscal policies, different policies on spending and taxes, and those things are now in conflict. So either this will bring them closer together, or it will lead to some kind of division of the ins and the outs. And I think what Paul Volcker was saying is those tensions, which people have talked about for a decade, are now very visible. So it's got to be resolved one way or the other. Either they get more integrated, more fundamental policy alignment, or less.
It's the conundrum of Europe. How vulnerable is America to a European-style sovereign debt crisis?
Well, America is very fortunate. We are able to borrow extraordinary sums of extraordinary sums of money at very low interest rates because in times of panic, people want to put money in U.S. dollars. As long as that lasts.
Is that confidence well placed?
Well, it's compared to what, right? What's the alternative? Japan? Europe? Australia? I know you don't have enough government bonds to satisfy the world economy because you've run such a responsible fiscal policy. You're not doing your part. So in the long run, it's not sustainable. In a panic, we're able to do it. The question is, will the U.S. come up with a business plan before the rest of the world decides it's become a large subprime borrower?
And can it?
It can, but it's not making very good progress now.
We'll come to that in a minute, because in a sense that's the last chapters of your book, perhaps,
exactly.
in Fed We Trust. One of the most enticing things about your book, I thought, is the sense of the inside view that you have. It's almost like you're in the room on some of those traumatic Sundays through the early months of the global financial crisis. How did you get these inside quotes?
Well, I wasn't in the room.
Smell the sweat in those rooms.
I wasn't in the room. I would love to have been there, but they didn't invite me in. I was either lucky or unlucky. I started this book in the spring of 2008 after episode 1, the collapse of Bear Stearns, the Wall Street Investment Bank, thinking that this was an extraordinary event in the history of the Federal Reserve and American economic policy, and I would go back and reconstruct what happened. So I was well along in my conversations with the officials when the real drama hit in September. So for me, it was kind of terrifying because I realized I was the idiot who tried to write a history of the Great Depression in about 1934. I had no idea how it was going to end. So as I was talking to people about what happened in March, I said, so what did you do yesterday? And if you talk to 3 or 4 people who were in the same meeting, you get a pretty good sense of what happened.
So all through this, people like Ben Bernanke and Henry Paulson and Tim Geithner were actually talking to you?
Yes.
It's an interesting position to be in, yeah. What's your favourite story that encapsulates this great panic of these weeks?
One thing was I was struggling to show these people as people, not as faceless bureaucrats. And I was sitting in the office of the General Counsel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and just on a whim, I said to him, "Did you ever spend the night in your office?" And he turned in his chair and reached into a file cabinet and opened up the bottom drawer of a file cabinet, and there was an air mattress because he had bought one. So it illustrated for me just how this was like fighting, for them, this was like fighting World War II without having time to get ready.
That's right. They didn't have food supplies. They didn't have beds.
They didn't have a manual to tell them what to do. All they really had to go on was Ben Bernanke's work on the Great Depression.
And what's interesting as you read the book is how many times they, well, you might call it flip-flop, but change their view within a matter of sort of one conversation on important things. And there's one chapter where you say Henry Paulson is talking about the Lehman Brothers, and in the end he says, "They're calling me Mr. Bailout. I can't do it again." Was it as much about his own sort of image that he said no to the Lehman Brothers bailout?
I think it was partly his image and partly his worldview. He genuinely did believe that if the government always comes in and rescues every failing financial institution, it'll have bad results in the future. But as the problem got worse, it became clear to him, perhaps a little later than to some of the people at the Fed, that this was an extraordinary moment where if they didn't bail out the entire financial system, we could have another Great Depression.
It's in your book, it is astonishing to just realise how much power the Fed wields. With one keystroke, it can create many multi-billions of dollars in cash from nothing, and without the approval of Congress or the President. That power was very much on show during the global financial crisis. The first time people realised it, it's angered many Americans. How do you think that's going to affect the Fed? Maybe has affected it already. Do you think the politicians will move to curb the powers of the Fed?
Yes, I think there's been an enormous backlash. People were shocked at how much power the Fed had, these unelected people who had been largely faceless. There's a huge uproar in the United States about the bailout. Most Americans seem to feel that Wall Street got bailed out and Main Street didn't. So there will be some constraints put on the Fed in the future that I think are healthy in a democratic society. The next time, God forbid, something like this happens, if Bernanke wants to use his power to lend to almost anybody, he'll have to get the formal okay of our Treasury Secretary. But they have warded off the more things they worried about the most. It looked for a moment like they might lose some of their independence to set interest rates, but they have survived that.
Getting the formal okay of the Treasury Secretary is one thing. What's notable in your book, and you make note of, is the lack of involvement in these decisions of the President, right. George W. Bush at the time.
Right. Well, I think that we need to create a better system so that the Federal Reserve is not the only first responder when there's a crisis like this. I found it extraordinary how little involvement George Bush had in this thing. He was at the end of his presidency. He was informed of major decisions. He was rarely one of the ones who made them. When I talked to people in the White House, I expected people to say to me, well, I just didn't see what was going on behind the scenes, and to tell me these stories about how he had everybody in the room and they all argued before him, but there wasn't any. It's just amazing.
And what do you put that down to?
I think that Paulson was a very strong man, and when he came in, he took control, and the White House at the end of the Bush administration was kind of depleted. Bush decided that his popularity was so bad that if he got too close to it, it would make things worse. And he just delegated the whole thing to Paulson and Bernanke. And
David, news is almost upon us, but the question I think that people are still split on from all of this, the time of in the height of the GFC, was whether the Fed and the Treasury should have stepped in to save Lehman Brothers or not. Too big to fail or not?
I think it's a very hard question to know what would have happened had they done something differently, but it's very hard to argue that this was the best strategy. So I think they should have been ready for Lehman Brothers so they had more choices when that came. Okay, David Wessel, thank you very much for joining us. You're welcome. David Wessel, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner journalist and economics editor of the Wall Street Journal, and he helped out us here on Breakfast during the global financial crisis. We spoke to him many times. He's the author of this book, In Fed We Trust, Ben Bernanke's War on the Great Panic, which is published in Australia by Scribe, and he's in town for the Sydney Writers' Festival.